Welcome to Poli-Sci 103. Obviously, it's government course, so let us begin the first week's lecture. What is your view of government? Notice we haven't defined what government is yet. I think pretty fundamental to most of us. We'll talk more about that later on. So, given what you know of government, what is your view of government? Is government good or evil? Just or unjust? Is it necessary even? Particularly given the events of the last little bit here in 2020, the experiment of Chaz, which mutated or evolved into Chop, if you will. What's your view of government? Are you an anarchist? Would you prefer to live under no government? I would suggest to you that individuals who are anarchists have never lived under the conditions in which they have advocated. They have never lived in what the historical political philosophers would have called a state of nature. Maybe the issue for us is not one about government, but maybe it is one about politics. For instance, if you look at government here, your text defines government as legitimate use of force to control human behavior. So there's a couple elements there that are interesting. So there's the use of force, but that force is legitimate. There's a legal right to it. And its intent, the purpose of that force, is to control human behavior. Maybe the dispute more that we have is more about politics. I.e., who controls the governmental process, or as your text says, the authoritative allocation for the values of society. So when you look at what's happened over the last little bit in 2020, with starting with the death of George Floyd and the reaction to that, and the protest, and then the rioting. And it's just moved across the country. What's your view? Is that protest good? Does that help keep the government in check, or is it in part just who is controlling the governmental process? Do people just not like Donald Trump, and so any excuse to express their displeasure with his administration is enough for them? So that would be more about politics. Now, anciently, there's this view of as what goes on in government. I mentioned a state of nature a moment ago. A state of nature, Thomas Hobbes, is not the kind of thing where you've got a rabbit and a fox. And basically, in order for the fox to survive, he's got to kill the rabbit to eat. That's not what Hobbes and the ancients were saying about a state of nature. What they meant by that was life without government. There was no central authority to control human interactions between each other. So if you come back here to this definition of government, the legitimate use of force to control human behavior. There was no institution prior to government in which there's that force to control human behavior. Now, see, we tend to take this for granted today that there's, and the reality is we want it. We want it. Look at it this way. Would you ever walk down the street, pass by somebody with a lethal weapon, and not care? Think about that for a second. But I'm telling you, the reality is you do that every day. Every day you step outside of your house. You get on the road, whether you're walking or you're driving. Every car out there is a lethal weapon. You get in that car, you drive wherever without a second thought as to the fact that somebody could just swerve their car into yours, use it as a weapon, and try and kill you. The reason you don't have that fear is because you know that there is a government out there that uses that force to control human behavior. That's what they do. If they were to do that, if somebody were to do that, the government would come in and control their behavior. In this case, after the fact, they would be punished, but then that would socialize the rest of us, that we can't get away with such acts of madness and atrocity. So this is exactly what Thomas Hobbes is saying, that this state of nature, what he meant by that was life without government. There was no institution to do that. So before government, this is what Hobbes says. He believed that life in a state of nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's just how it was. For instance, let's take a famous example here, and let us go to a case, a little video somebody did about Bambi meets Godzilla that illustrates this fact. So let me just change here for a second to a different app. Okay, watch this. You won't be able to hear the sound. There's just some music playing. So here's Bambi out in the middle of some meadow, minding his own business, just eating. This is written by Marv Newland and directed the whole bit. It's not a very long film. Bambi's just minding his own business. So Marv's put himself over everything, and he had to do that because there's really not much going on here. And the movie is just about to come to an end. Now watch this. And there it is. So the question becomes, let us assume that Godzilla stepped on Bambi just to feel the sensation of Bambi's flesh going through Godzilla's 3 toes. Does that give Godzilla a legitimate right to do that? And the answer is, it really doesn't matter, because they are in a state of nature. There is no higher authority. There is no entity to control what goes on. This is exactly what Hobbes meant when he said life in a state of nature was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. People would do what they had to survive. And so that's kind of what's going on here. What is it? Is government good? And the ancient political philosophy, well, I shouldn't say the ancient, these people are 1600s. They would argue that government was good. Government was good because it prevents things from happening that we find distasteful. Yes, it controls our behavior, but it also controls everybody else's behavior. And if it doesn't control them, then they punish them, and that's how they control other people. So the dispute we have today really is not whether government is good or bad, just or unjust. It's really who controls that governmental process. Yes, there are instances in which you can have forms of government that militate towards abuse, and we will get into that. But really today, our dispute is over politics, not over government. Now let's go on to a related issue. Going back to that definition, there it is. Now, the original purpose of government, and this goes back way to the beginning, not the beginning of the United States, but just way to the beginning of time. So the original purpose, there was 2 original purposes of government. That was to protect life and to protect property. To protect life and protect property fell under the auspices of maintaining order. And then the other purpose was to provide for public goods. Now, the public goods are not the type of goods that we see the government providing for today. Those type of public goods, not the government providing health care, not the government providing Social Security, things like that. Public goods would have been roads, things that people need in order to survive and hopefully thrive. Now, this maintaining order and providing for public goods were the original purposes of government. And again, this maintaining order really had two aspects to it: protecting life and protecting property. There has been a contemporary purpose added to government, and that is to create equality. Now, this contemporary purpose really gets its first play with the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. This is the kind of equality this contemporary purpose of government has. It's not the kind of equality that is militated towards today, such as economic equality. That's not what the Founding Fathers saw as being this contemporary purpose of equality. This was a kind of political equality, and yes, they were not perfect in that political equality. Obviously, women and slaves were not part of the equation, but this was the equality that they were going for. That each individual was equal in the eyes of the government, assuming they were citizens. And again, we'll get into that throughout the course. All right, let's move on. Now the question becomes, how does a society best provide for and maintain these values? You've got these values that we've just talked about, maintaining order and providing public goods, and this contemporary value of equality. How does society, what form, what system do we have that will best maintain those values? And so the system really is government. And government is the institution which enforces society's values. And again, we've already talked about this idea of politics, control over the governmental process, particularly in the United States today. We don't have people protesting and rioting saying that the government is bad, that the government is evil. The government, they might say it's unjust, but they're not saying the government is unjust. They're saying the control of the governmental process. Who's deciding what is unjust? For instance, the Democrats in the House are really doing this with respect to Trump. They're not trying to change the system. They're just trying to control the system. Now, there's another component here which we've hinted at, and that is one of authority. Authority is the right to use power or force. And where do you get that authority? You get that authority through winning elections in our system. In no other way. We can hedge on that a little bit, but as far as the government itself, the institutions which enforces society's values, you get that through holding public office. And again, we'll get into the bureaucracy, which is an appointed institution of government. But again, in general here, this is what we're talking about. Now, another question. What makes that authority legitimate and therefore creates political obligation? So, going back, authority, the right to use power. So what makes that power legitimate and therefore creates political obligation? Suppose, for instance, that the draft, in essence, the draft said to those individuals who were drafted in World War I, World War II, and Vietnam and Korea, you are being tapped on the shoulder, and you are being sent off to war in which you may die for your country. And no, you don't have a choice. You have to do this. This is pretty amazing reality here, that a government can send individuals off to die, to potentially die for the country. And there's something about that makes that legitimate and therefore creates political obligation. Think about that for a second. And I'm almost out of time on this video, so that'll give you some time to switch. What creates legitimate political obligation?